Good evening. This is great. Look at it. Wow. January what? 11? What are we at? 12. Wow, that's great. New Year's resolution. Keep coming to these. I'm Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement at the Pratt. I'm very happy you're here. We restarted our lecture series about 9 months ago when I showed up. This is our 49th program, and we have a lot more coming January and February. Pick up a compass out front, which is our promotional magazine. There's something in there for everybody. This Saturday, we have Ben Jealous coming to talk about his new book. Kwame Alexander and Dar Coulter are going to be here on Tuesday. They have a picture book called An American Story about a history of slavery. Everyone who attends that event will get a free book. Please come out. And then Kadeta Williams, a historian, will be here on January 19th to talk about Reconstruction. So please come back to the Pratt. There's no reason why you shouldn't. I've lived in this town for 12 years. Baltimoreans don't like crowds. And if there's a line, they will just be like, forget it. I don't do Artscape. Have you seen the news? I don't get it. We have free parking here at the Pratt. There's no excuse for you not to come. If you come to Franklin Street Garage, you can park, come up to me or my colleague, Sophia Nawali. We will give you a $5 pass, cover your parking. So it's something that we offer here so you can come back into the building. If you can't make it, we also provide these programs online free of charge, and they're always archived at our YouTube page. So again, thanks for coming to the Pratt Library. 45-minute discussion today, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. There is an audience mic there, and there will be one right there. Please bring your questions to those microphones so that the audience back home can hear you. Also, after the program, Clint will go out to sign books. Our good friends, Urban Reads Bookstore, are here. They're selling books. Please pick one up. I always say this, it's a lame joke, but you can't get your book or your library book signed. Or maybe you could. Or maybe you could and just keep it. See, why does that work? Or you just feel like really bad for me. Tonight, I'm happy to welcome Clint Smith to the Pratt Library to discuss his best-selling and award-winning book, How the Word is Passed. In it, he looks at the legacy of slavery in America through his visits to historical monuments and landmarks. Throughout the author's travels, from Monticello to New Orleans and Manhattan, he reflects on the ways that we talk and also avoid talking about slavery. Clint Smith, the author of the poetry collection Counting Descent, and the forthcoming Above Ground, comes out in March. His debut nonfiction title, How the Word is Passed, was the recipient of several awards, including the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction. He is also a staff writer at The Atlantic. This evening, he is joined in conversation by Carsanya Wise-Whitehead, host of the award-winning Today with Dr. K on WEAA 88.9 FM. She is the founding director of the Carson Institute for Race, Peace, and Social Justice, as well as a communication African and African American studies professor at Loyola University. The New York Times Book Review's Julian Lucas called How the Word is Passed a tour of tours and a reckoning with reckonings, which sketches an impressive and deeply affecting human cartography of America's historical conscience. The book's standout quality is the range and sincerity of its encounters. Smith walks with tourists, guides, teachers, scholars, ex-convicts, local historians, and heritage zealots, managing to catch nearly everyone in a moment of unscripted candor. And historian and best-selling author Ibram Kendi simply stated, "We need this book." It is my great pleasure to welcome Clint Smith and Carsanya Wise-Whitehead to the Pratt Library.
Thank you so much for joining us. So I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since I read the book, because I have quite a few questions. So let me begin by asking you, when you sat down to write How the Word is Passed, who were you writing for?
Well, thank you all, first off, so much for coming. Thank you all. Thank you for joining me in conversation. Baltimore is one of my favorite cities. I always love making the trip up here. And in the context of who the book was written for, I always tell people that the book was written for like a 15-year-old version of me. Mm-hmm. You know, I remember the catalyst for this book, the thing that led to it being written, is that in 2017, I watched several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching these statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy, that my parents still live on a street today, named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols, they're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry, and those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives, which isn't to say that if you just, take down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee, you suddenly get rid of the racial wealth gap. But it does help us recognize, I think, the sort of ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help give us context for the history of certain communities in this country and the way that certain communities have been disproportionately and intentionally harmed throughout American history. And so I was looking around the city and realizing that as these monuments came down and realizing that I didn't understand the history of slavery in a way that felt commensurate to the impact and legacy that it had on this country. And what did that mean as someone who was born and raised in New Orleans? What did that mean, given that New Orleans was at one point the largest, busiest slave market in the country, that I am the descendant of enslaved people? And so I remember growing up as a kid in New Orleans and being inundated with these messages about all the things that were wrong with Black people, especially as a kid in the 90s, the violence and the crime and the poverty and all the suggestions, sometimes implicit and sometimes very direct, that those existed to the extent that they did in the Black community because of things that Black people were responsible themselves for. And I knew it was wrong, but I didn't have the language or the sort of historical or sociological toolkit with which to push back against it. And it wasn't until later in my life where I gained a deeper sense of the history of New Orleans, a deeper sense of the history of this country, and part of that being the history of slavery and the role that it played in shaping the social, political, and economic infrastructure of my community today, that I was able to more fully recognize that, the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not because of the people in those communities, but is because of what has been done to those communities or taken away from those communities generation after generation after generation. And so I wanted to write the sort of book that I felt like I needed in my high school American history class, the sort of book that would have given me that language that I was looking for, to more effectively make sense of the world and my relationship to it.
And that's interesting because when I asked you the question, I made the assumption, apparently wrong, that you were going to say you were writing for your children. You spoke in the back about how you have a 5.5-year-old, 3-year-old. So I thought maybe he's writing the book for who your children are going to become versus who you used to be. Because at 15 years old, if we go back in time, this would have been a phenomenal book. If we go back to when you were 15. During the 90s, this is not the kind of literature we were getting in our classrooms.
Yeah.
And maybe we weren't even prepared to accept this history or had teachers who could teach this type of history in the way that we do now. Like, this is an incredible understanding of slavery that's a very nuanced understanding that I'm not even sure if a 15-year-old, without the correct teacher walking them through it, could understand. Now, you have your PhD in education from Harvard. So talk about how a teacher who's trying to understand American history through their own lens of bias, whether they're Black or white or Asian or Hispanic, however they're seeing the world, how this book, through the places where you spent time, Monticello, think about that and how we're dealing with Sally Hemings, how can they even teach this to help a 15-year-old understand why it's important?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things. I guess my hope is that, my children, this book won't be as necessary for them. My hope is that the way that the conversation around American history, around chattel slavery, around race looked very different in the 90s than it does today. And I think it is it is not without the backlash, obviously, that we see, the state sanctioned backlash that we see in state legislatures across the country, the way that certain school boards are attempting to prevent teachers and librarians from sharing books with students that provide certain historical accounts that students might not otherwise be encountering. But I do think that generally we are having a more nuanced, sophisticated public conversation about this part of our history than we have previously. So to that end, my hope is that this book will be like par for the course for my kids, like when they reach, 15, 16 years old, and that it would not be as revelatory a text as it would have been for me. In terms of how I hope that teachers can use the book, I mean, one of the things that I try to do in the book, and I try to sort of bring this together in the epilogue is about my grandparents. My grandfather, born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi, and my grandmother, born in 1939, Jim Crow, Florida. And, I decided to interview my grandparents because I'd spent 4 years traveling across the country, being in conversation with, people all, at plantations and prisons and historical sites, interviewing these strangers and asking them these questions about their lives, these like very intimate, personal questions about their life stories. And I realized that I had never brought that same level of intentionality to my own family, right? Like I never sat down and intentionally asked my mother some of the sorts of questions that I was asking people that I would never see again. And that certainly never did the same for my grandparents. And as my grandparents were getting older, 2 of them have already passed away, it felt there was a different level of urgency in terms of getting a sense of what, like, before this book, I don't know that I could have told you what my grandfather's childhood, in Monticello, Mississippi, was like. And so I remember bringing my grandparents to the National Museum of African American History and Culture and pushing my grandfather in his wheelchair, his cane laid across his lap, my grandmother walking a few paces ahead of us. And this was their first time in the museum. This was in 2017. And we're walking through this museum, and I'm watching them observe this museum, and realizing that so many of the things that they were seeing were things that they had experienced firsthand. And when I left and had a conversation with my grandmother later about our experience there, she had this refrain where she was like, I lived it. I lived it. I lived it. And for me, part of how the word is passed was an attempt to gain a deeper sense of our collective physical proximity to the history of slavery, right? How the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape all around us. In a city like Baltimore, I mean, it's literally every step you take is suffused with the history of slavery. But in doing so, I think part of what I came to realize was that in searching for our collective physical proximity to this history, I got a deeper sense of our temporal proximity to this history, and a deeper sense of how this history that we tell ourselves was a long time ago simply just wasn't that long ago at all. I mean, the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture was a woman named Ruth Bonner. In 2016, she rang the bell next to the Obama family to sort of symbolically open this museum. And Ruth Bonner was the daughter of an enslaved person, right? Not the great-granddaughter, not the granddaughter. She was the daughter of someone who was born into slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So I look at my 5-year-old son sitting on my grandfather's lap. I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And you're just reminded again that, oh, this history we tell ourselves that we've been told was so long ago. Wasn't that long ago at all. I was taught about slavery as if it was in the Jurassic period, right? Like it was the dinosaurs, the Flintstones, and slavery, like all hanging out. And it was just, and then you go to these places and you go to these sites, and this is, more directly answering the question, but like, my hope is that an exploration of these sites that carry within them the histories, this history, that we gain, that the reader gains, or that it inspires the reader to go to places within their own community that would facilitate this within themselves, a deeper sense of proximity and intimacy to a history that in the scope of human history was only like a few minutes ago. And so that's, I think one of the things that I hope teachers can use this text to convey, and that I hope every reader comes away with, is a different sense of how recent all of this was.
Now, before we get too far into the books, I want to open up the pages of it. I just have one more question for you, because thinking about this experience and talking to your grandparents and trying to understand where slavery fits, not Jurassic period and the Flintstones, but it's just your grandfather going back one generation. This must have been a hard experience for you. It's hard to read the book and to begin to wrestle, not with past history, but present history. What did James Baldwin say? Like, we carry our history with us. This is our history. What did you learn about yourself from pouring this out of you?
It's interesting because I wrote this book, as I was writing this book, my wife and I were starting our family. And now, as we've talked about in the back, I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. And what's interesting is that when I had been taught about slavery, I feel like I was taught about it when I was taught about the violence of slavery. I think I was taught about it specifically through the prism of like the spectacle of physical brutality and the physical violence that was enacted on people. I mean, you think about the famous scene in Roots, you know, where like Kunta Kinte is being beaten, and it, you know, those are the sorts of things that are presented to us in the media, through our television, through our movies, to convey the barbarity of what slavery was. And it wasn't until both the combination of having my own children, and then there was this moment where I was at Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. And at Whitney, they have the original slave cabins, some of the original slave cabins. And I remember this moment where I stepped into the slave cabin, and you know, there's these wooden planks made from the cypress trees that line the Mississippi River. And you step on the planks and you hear the wood moan under your feet. You look up and the sunlight is sort of sneaking in through different cracks in the roof. And you think about how susceptible to the elements and the outside these folks would have been. And you think about the families who lived in these spaces. And when I was standing in this cabin, I did this exercise where I closed my eyes and I tried to imagine what it would be like if I put my children to sleep. And then I woke up the next day and my children were gone. And I had no idea who had taken them, no idea where they went. I had no idea if I would ever see them again. And it is such a viscerally gutting, unfathomable thing to imagine, right? This idea that you might go to sleep and wake up and your children are gone, or that it might be done right in front of you. And then you have this moment where you realize that, oh, this was the omnipresent threat that millions and millions of people lived under every single day of their lives over the course of generations, that at any moment you could be taken away from your husband, your wife, your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, your siblings, your entire community for no reason at all. And so the violence of family separation was something that hadn't fully registered with me until I had a family of my own, until I had children of my own. And I think obviously with this book, part of what I believe in is the power of like putting your body in the place where history happened. And I think it facilitates a different sort of historical empathy, a different sense of the sort of emotional stakes. Because again, I keep coming back to these words, but like the proximity that you feel, the intimacy that you feel with the space, I think allows for like a different imaginative depth within yourself that simply might not exist in the same way. And so part of what I learned about myself is that and why the book ended up becoming what it became, it wasn't originally conceived of as like being so place-based, but the more places I went, the more I was like, oh, it's the places that are the ones that are serving as catalysts to the sort of reflections and engagement with the archives and engagement with the historiography that I want to follow. Like this is the story is the places and how they tell the story of who they were. And so part of what I learned about myself is that like place matters, and it serves as a really important entry point into and sort of window into both history and your relationship to history.
If you can talk a little bit, coming from the prologue into the first chapter, you talk about the Monticello plantation, which I think is interesting because on the back you have a blurb here from Annette Gordon Reed, and her whole work is around Sally Hemings. To me, out of all the places that you visited, and we'll get into that, this is kind of the most polished place. It's set up as a museum. You have people there who are recreating history. I mean, through the work of Annette Gordon Reed, they brought Sally Hemings' story and the story of her children into a real life understanding of the Monticello plantation. Did you find in going through there with history and nostalgia that you talk about, and because it is so polished, how does it shape the story about how slavery is told through that particular plantation?
You know, one of the reasons I wanted to go to Monticello and start the book in Monticello is because I think that Jefferson sort of embodies the cognitive dissonance of the American project, which is to say, America is a place that is provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their own ancestors could have never imagined. And it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It's not one over here and one over there. You get to talk about one and not talk about the other. They're both deeply entangled in one another. And Jefferson, I think, personifies that moral inconsistency. He's someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and is also someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. He wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and wrote in notes on the state of Virginia that Black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. And so I wanted to go to this place that seemed to, whose patron was a person who I think embodied the dissonance of this country. And I wanted to understand how an institution responsible for cultivating and curating and communicating the legacy of this person, who's a monumental, albeit complicated, complex figure in American history, what version of the story were they telling? Were they telling the full, were they perpetuating the sort of mythology of Jefferson that I received when I was a kid that like didn't talk at all about how he enslaved his own children or what he thought about enslaved people or slavery at all? Or were they attempting to tell like a more holistic, more honest, more empirically grounded, but also complex story about a complex, morally inconsistent man? And I think Monticello is a place that represents the idea that a historical institution and a historical site is not static, right? Because how Monticello told the story of itself 20 years ago, 10 years ago, is very different than how Monticello tells the story of itself now, right? And that's in part thanks to people, first and foremost, probably Annette Gordon Reed, whose seminal work on Jefferson has unlocked for all of us a new understanding of who Jefferson was, and perhaps more importantly, who the enslaved people who lived at Monticello were. And so Monticello does like a lot of important work of, collecting the stories and oral histories of the descendants of those who were enslaved at Monticello, now, working very hard to ensure that when they tell the story of Monticello on their tours, when they tell the story of Jefferson, that they are rendering him like a full, complicated human and not just a two-dimensional caricature of himself. And so, Monticello also has a different set of resources. It has a different set of, a different history. It is probably the most famous plantation in the country, if not the world, given who the person who it belonged to. But what is most, the thing I leave thinking about most with Monticello is just that historical sites can change, and they don't have to be singularly tethered to the story that was their origin story, but that they can actually sort of reimagine and recalibrate how they tell the story of themselves to ensure that these places like Monticello, that are often on the front lines of our historical and cultural battles, are being honest. Because the thing about some of these historical sites, and one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by them, is because 1 million people visit Monticello every year. There aren't 1 million people who buy any book about slavery, right? And so there are people who, many of the people I met, who will go to a place like Monticello after they, on their way to DC, or leaving the winery, or who will stumble across it, or who will go there, like Donna and Grace, who I met because they just wanted to see Jefferson's home, and I think it gives them an opportunity to reach people who might not necessarily be looking for, or know that, or even cognizant of a part of American history that Monticello has the opportunity to share with them.
But Monticello went into that kicking and screaming, right? If you go back and you look at what Annette Gordon Reed writes, when she was talking to them about Sally Hemings, they were reluctant to change. They were reluctant to change the narrative. It was through her work and the successful way as a lawyer that she broke down and made the argument that Sally Hemings was an essential part of this story. And then you had kind of this public push to include them. So there's a kicking and screaming as well.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that Monticello should close, because there was a big call that we need to close the place down. We don't need these monuments. So if Monticello remains open and the history has changed, then what do we do with Confederate statues? Do we hide them away in a museum? Do you think we should have kept them out there and then talk about how the story has changed?
I think that people of good faith can have different ideas of what should be done to certain statues, right? I think, 12 of our first 18 presidents owned enslaved people. 8 of them owned enslaved people while they were in the White House. You cannot tell a story of early America. You cannot tell a story of our founding and the people who, ostensibly led this country without talking about their relationship to chattel slavery. And there are a lot of statues and street names and school buildings named after those people. I think that, again, there are people who are good faith interlocutors and people who are who thoughtfully consider these questions, who can come out on different sides. And that Gordon Reed, is someone who has been against many of the calls to take down statues of Jefferson, right? Like I remember, New York City removed a statue of Jefferson from the city council chamber. And she didn't want that to happen, right? And so, and this is the person who brought to the public a sort of understanding of the Hemings family and an understanding of Jefferson as an enslaver, perhaps more profoundly than anyone else. But I think that with Confederate statues and iconography, for me, the conversation feels different. Like it feels different to ask, what do you do with Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson than it does to ask what you do with Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Andrew Jackson. Because leaders of the Confederacy created a country. They seceded from the Union and built a country with the specific and singular intention to perpetuate and expand the institution of human bondage. And sometimes when you say that, people think you're sort of saying it in like as an ideological statement, but it's the empirical, right? Like you look at the declarations of Confederate secession before the Civil War. A state like Mississippi says in 1861, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world." So they're not vague about why they're seceding from the Union. Like they're very clear about it. They're like there's no confusion. For me, to understand both what the Confederacy was founded upon and to understand the specific context that led to the erection of these monuments in the first place, which was very often tied to an effort to instill terror within the states, municipalities, communities where these statues were erected toward the Black community. For me, there is no justification. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit of the debate for me. Like there's no justification for having them in parks, in courthouses, in public spaces paid for, maintained by taxpayer dollars. If you want to have a statue of Robert E. Lee in your backyard, in your living room, that's weird, but like do your thing, right? And so for me, it's not a question of like, do I think they should exist? Like it's not a question of should they exist or not exist. It's fine if they exist, but it is different if I'm paying for it. And if it is presented and erected in a way that is meant to suggest veneration, that I pass every day. Like, and if a museum wants to do it, so I believe that they should come down. And but I also think that what happens to them after they come down is a decision that should be made by local communities, right? Like, I don't think it's a sort of one-stop shop or like there's a single blanket answer for what it looks like when Baltimore or Richmond or Charlottesville or DC or New Orleans or Lexington or wherever. Like I think what all of those places do with those statues when they take them down depends on the specific context of that community. Like what that statue represented in Charlottesville meant something very specific, and then became deeply entangled in the white nationalist rally in 2017. And so, some places are melting them and then using them to create new art. Some places are placing them in museums. Some places are placing them in private collections. But in terms of them standing up in public places being maintained and paid for by taxpayer dollars, I don't think there's any justification for it.
Which leads into your chapter here on the Blandford Cemetery, which I think is fascinating in terms of thinking about Confederate soldiers looking at Black men in uniform. I thought very deeply about what Frederick Douglass said when he was making the argument for why Lincoln should allow Black men to join the army, that when they get, that rifle, that weapon on their shoulder, when they get the uniform on their back, then they're fighting for something much greater than themselves, much deeper than this idea of what America is going to be, that there's something else intrinsic here. But you talk here about this story about white soldiers in the Confederate Army and how brutal they were, even after Black soldiers surrendered. That for them, it was about a slave revolt and not just the Union Army. Can you talk a little bit about that and about your experience down at the cemetery?
Yeah, I mean, the most famous example of that is Fort Pillow, where a regiment led by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who would go on to become the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. The understanding within the military, even in opposing military units, was that like if a unit surrenders, they become prisoners of war, and you don't shoot people who are like waving a white flag or putting their arms up. So you had these hundreds of Black men who were surrendering, and then instead of becoming prisoners of war, they were massacred after they had said that they were surrendering and put down their weapons. And it was, the thing that you have to understand, and you said this, is that like these folks understood what Black people, the idea that Black people had been given weapons and that they were fighting in uniform for the Union Army. They weren't seen as soldiers. It was understood as a slave rebellion. And as a result, they saw their duty as putting down an insurrection. And animating all of this is the sort of terrorism behind it, right? Like you massacre 400 Black soldiers to send a message to other Black soldiers in that army to say like, this is what's going to happen to you, right? Like to make it seem as if death is inevitable for you. And this is what you are risking when you put on that uniform. And so terror is what animated so much of the experience of slavery. It's why when somebody ran away, they were brought back and tortured in front of everybody so that you could send a message to everybody else in the plantation. And, you massacre hundreds of Black soldiers surrendering so you can send a message both to the Union Army and to Black soldiers in the Army. My experience at Blandford, for context, for folks who've not read it, it is one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country, where the remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And I went there for the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration. And it's interesting because like, I didn't write my book proposal saying like, I'm going to go to spend the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans. My wife would have been like, no, you're not. And that's the thing I loved about this book, is that sometimes the book shows you where it needs to go. And so I thought I was going to write a chapter on Civil War battlefields. So I went to Petersburg to write this chapter on this, the National Park Service, the national park that, is tasked with commemorating the siege of Petersburg toward the end of the Civil War, one of the sort of last stands before the war ended. And I went, and it was a fascinating place, and I was having a conversation with this park ranger, and I was telling him about my project, and he was like, oh, you should really go to this Confederate cemetery down the road. And then it's interesting because in those moments, it's like, how you have the angel and the devil like on the shoulders in the TV shows. And so like I had that, but it's like Ryder Clint and regular Clint. And so Ryder Clint is like, we absolutely have to go to the Confederate cemetery. And regular Clint is like, no, we're not going to the Confederate cemetery. We are not going to do that. No chance. And so in those moments, Ryder Clint wins out because it's just like, oh, this is where the story is taking me. And I remember the moment where I was, I went on this tour, and it was fascinating because it's, Confederate flags are sort of ubiquitous around all the gravestones. And but I went on this tour, and they were talking, giving me a tour of the chapel, but didn't say the word Confederacy at all, didn't talk about the Confederate Army. It felt like such a conspicuous absence. And I was talking to one of the guides and the director of the center about it in the visitor center, and there was this moment where we were having a conversation, and in front of me to my left, like there's a counter between us, and to the left is this flyer. And I was like, well, what's on this flyer? And I sort of peek over in my peripheral vision, and the woman like immediately puts her hand on it and like throws the paper somewhere else. And she's like, I don't know what that is. I don't know who they are. Like, I don't. And it was a flyer for the Sons of Confederate Veterans event. She was like, I don't know those people. Who is that? Like, I don't know how'd that get here. I was like, ma'am, you're the director of the center. Like, what are you talking about? But it's another one of those moments where like regular Clint is like, nah, Clint, we're not going to go to the Sons of Confederate Veterans celebration. And writer Clint is like, this is where we got to go. So after getting permission from my wife and taking my white friend Billy, she was like, you can only go to spend the day with the Confederates if you take Billy. I called Billy and I was like, Billy, you got to go. And Billy was like, I got you. But he was like, I have some questions first. But then he was like, I got you. So we went down, and it was just really illuminating because it for me it helped make clear that for so many people, history is not about primary source documents or empirical evidence. It's a story that they're told, and it's a story that they tell. It's an heirloom that's passed down across generations. I'll always remember this conversation I had with a guy named I'm like losing his name now. The guy at the Confederate cemetery, who he had this long salt and pepper ponytail, handlebar mustache, and this biker vest with Confederate paraphernalia all over it. He was telling me the story about how when he was a kid, his grandfather used to bring him to the cemetery, and his grandfather would sit him in this gazebo, and they would have, and he would sing him the old Dixie anthem, and they would watch the sunset beyond the trees and watch the sky turn from blue to orange to purple to black. And they'd watch the fireflies come out from the trees at night, watch the deer sort of graze on the grass around the tombstones. These very like intimate memories. And he would say and talk about the things how his grandfather told him that like the people who were buried here, they didn't fight a war for slavery. They didn't fight a war over secession. They fought a war for, to protect their families, protect their culture against the war of Northern invasion, to, all of these sort of Confederate lost cause platitudes. And then he talked about how now he brings his granddaughters to that same cemetery and sings the same songs to them that his grandfather sang to him, and tells his granddaughters the same stories his grandfather told to him. And you just realize that like, oh, this is how this story gets passed down. And the thing is, if I go to him and say, I know your grandfather told you that the Civil War had nothing to do, slavery had nothing to do with this Civil War, and secession had nothing to do with slavery. For him, it's not simply asking him to do a historical reassessment. It represents like an existential threat to his identity, because if you are asking him to, if he has to accept that slavery was a central cause of the Civil War, was the cause of the Civil War, was the cause of secession, if he has to read the Declarations of Confederate Secession, if he has to read the Crittenden Amendments, if he has to read the cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, that said no other nation on earth has ever been founded upon the great principle that the black man is inherently inferior to the white man, and that black people should be enslaved in perpetuity by the white man. But if he has to accept that, then he has to accept that his grandfather was lying to him. Right. And if he has to accept that his grandfather was lying to him, it threatens to disintegrate the foundation of a relationship that is so central to his sense of self. And so it's not a question of like, are you going to believe this information or not? It's like, if you believe and accept this information, you have to relinquish something that was so fundamental to your sense of self and to these, like this man that you love, this man who represents a community that shaped who you are. And I think that's the thing about so many of these sites. It's the same thing when you go to Monticello, and all the guides will tell you about all the pushback they get when people try to talk about Jefferson as an enslaver. There's so much pushback because when people see Jefferson, they think they see America. And when they see America, when they think of America, they think about a very specific story. And that story does not include the parts of, Native American genocide, parts of chattel slavery that are now being included at a place like Monticello. So yeah, I think what I learned is that you have to take seriously the human component and the sort of familial texture that undergirds so many of these really dangerous and harmful beliefs. And it's not to say you excuse them, but it is to say that you recognize that Like it was important for me to go to that Confederate cemetery and understand that these were not simply caricatures of bigotry, but they were people who take their kids to soccer games and go to the post office and go to the grocery store the same as us, and whose commitment to a certain story that is entangled in like loyalty to a specific family narrative is what prevents them from engaging with this recalibration of history that's kind of happening all around us.
Now, before we open up for questions, because I want to get one more question in here, then we'll open up. We haven't even talked about Angola Prison, which is my favorite chapter, so I want to get to that after we get to the questions. But I want to ask you, as we go into this weekend where we're thinking about Dr. King and thinking about, how do we celebrate him? How do we recognize him? What should we be doing? In '68, there was this argument being made with the Kerner Commission that we're no longer fighting a war against policies and practices and laws and procedures. What we're really fighting a war against is the heart and mind. And that's a harder battlefield. Like, it's hard to win the battlefield of the heart and mind. I thought about that as you talked about the man saying, look, I'm singing Dixie songs because that's a connection to my grandfather, in the same way that my grandmother taught me how to make a pound cake. Like, you cannot tell me that her pound cake's not the best because it's tied up in who she was and who she was to me. So just like you can't change my idea of the best pound cake, how do we get into the hearts and minds of people say, you know what, your grandfather lied to you and you're lying to your kids and one day they're going to lie to their kids. And if we don't stop the lie, then we're never going to ultimately win the final battlefield, which is around hearts and minds.
Yeah. I think that what I tried to do in that space in particular, part of the answer is I don't know. But what I do know is that I think you have to ask people questions, and you have to provide space for them to share answers that you might not like. And because if you don't, like if I went to that Confederate cemetery and was immediately approaching them with like an antagonistic disposition and was immediately trying to do this gotcha, or was immediately trying to make them look dumb or push back against them as soon as they said something, they're going to get defensive. They're not going to open up to me. If the first thing I go and say is like, you're racist, like it's not, that might be true, right? But it also, if the goal is to change hearts and minds or to understand something more on a more human level, that's not an effective way to do it. And so for this, I went and I was just like, I just had to ask questions. And I had to, and you can read in the chapter, like many of the things that they said were like very upsetting. But it is the only way that I would get insight into why they believed what they believed. And I think when you open up space for people to share their experiences or their ideas without immediately indicting them as terrible people, I think the most helpful thing you can do is ask questions, because when people are forced to answer certain questions, then they are forced to sort of like examine why they believe those things in a different way. Like for me, some of the best interviewers, when you go on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and I'm sure, with your radio show and all these, like the best interviewers are people who ask you questions that when you answer, you're like, huh. Like, you be on Fresh Air and you're like, dang, this is like therapy. I don't know why, Terry. Like, why did my mother tell me that when I was 12? And how did that, And so I think there is something useful about just asking questions and just giving them. And sometimes you don't have to like tell people anything, because sometimes they'll tell on themselves. They'll like tell themselves something they didn't realize as they are forced to excavate something within themselves. With that said, I don't think it's anybody's job to like go around and like try to change the hearts and minds of neo-Confederates. Like that's not necessarily, that's not what I'm advocating, but I do think as we think about, I know that for me, my heart and mind have changed around certain things because there were people who were generous toward me in ways that I didn't necessarily deserve. But I might have said something harmful or said something that was unwittingly said by mistake. But there were people who like invited me in and shared the impact that what I said had on them, that allowed for me to do recalibration within myself without immediately feeling like, oh, I'm a terrible person. So, I think it's a combination of things. You have to make decisions about when you call people in versus call people out, what it means because I think interpersonally with individuals, it's very hard to get somebody to listen to if all you're doing is calling them out. I think that's different with institutions. I think there's a different responsibility with institutions to call them out. But in terms of like, the psychology of a person, you have to recognize that, it's just like, imagine if somebody said to you something that immediately made you feel a sense of shame. And that's not to say shame is not useful. I think shame is very useful, but you have to, I just think, I'm gonna go on and on, but I just think opening up space for people to wrestle with questions is one of the most important things we can do.
Thank you. I want to open it up for questions. There are microphones on both sides. Feel free to step up. I see a gentleman stepping up now, making his way, coming down the aisle.
You mentioned the ability to reteach certain institutions or certain aspects of history in a more contemporary light or more correct terms. Do you think such a thing is possible, potentially, but divisive if you try to do the same with how some say slavery should be referred to as human traffickers, or the Confederacy should be referred to as like a hostile, terroristic, or foreign nation? Do you feel as though there's a place for such a thing in education today?
Yeah, it's good to see you. Good to see Davis and folks. I take seriously like the idea that like this language you use has certain implications, and so I make an effort to say, not always consistently, but like enslaved person versus slave, right? Or enslaver versus master. Just because I do think it is important, almost more for myself as much as it is as much for myself as it is for the people who are listening to me, to ensure that I am reminding myself and others that like slavery was a system imposed upon a person rather than an inherent static trait of something tied to a person's personhood. For me, and like for language, I think so much of it is about context, right? I was having a conversation just a few days ago with somebody who was interviewing me, asked a similar question, and they were like, well, for someone who escaped slavery, do you call them a self-emancipated person, a fugitive slave, an escaped slave? Like, I don't necessarily know that any of those, for example, are wrong. I think that each one is useful and should be applied in a specific context, and depending on how you're using it, shapes whether or not it's appropriate. And in the context of how we use those terms today, I think that the most important thing is precision, because I think that sometimes we can use language to convey a sense of urgency at the expense of intellectual consistency. So to be concrete, I have a lot of friends and colleagues and peers who will say mass incarceration is slavery, right? Or very different variations of that. I am deeply sympathetic to that frame, and I understand why that frame is used. I've studied mass incarceration in children sentenced to life without parole for my dissertation in graduate school. I've been teaching in prisons for years now. I wrote this chapter on Angola and how similar it is to slavery. But for me, that slavery, chattel slavery and mass incarceration are two phenomenologically different things. And we don't have to say that they are the same in order to convey the urgency of the two of them. Like chattel slavery was unique, a historically unique phenomenon in that, like, because of partis sequitur ventrem, like, you took on the status of your mother. So if you were born to an enslaved woman, you were inherently enslaved. That's very different than prison, where, like, if you are born to someone in prison, you are not inherently an imprisoned person. Obviously, there's a sociological relationship between your likelihood of ending up in prison if you have an imprisoned parent. But I do think that it is important to we have to be careful of conflating things, even when there are a lot of similarities. Because, as I talk about in Angola, it says, the scholar Cynthia Hartman says, prisons are very much the afterlife of slavery. Yeah. They're the residue of slavery, the remnants of that system, but it is not that system. So it's a long way of saying, I think those applying certain terms in contemporary context to different historical phenomena can be useful, but we also have to be mindful of not being imprecise in how we use those comparisons.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. There was this gentleman over here, and then we'll come back over here.
Yeah, this is a quick one. Thanks for coming to Baltimore. So as we speak, I understand West Point is purging names and monuments off of their campus. So what to do about I've never seen it, a Confederate monument that's in Arlington National Cemetery. I would think that would be the last place that you'd want to have a Confederate monument.
Yeah, I mean, so I am not an expert or as well versed in the sort of the landscape of Arlington National Cemetery in terms of what's there. Like, I know there are also Confederate soldiers buried there. And so I don't want to overly simplify anything without understanding the totality of the context. But I think generally my belief still applies that it should not be there. I just don't, it is hard for me to come up with a justification for any monument or memorial to a group of people, a treasonous territory that raised an army specifically predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery. It just runs counter to any notion of justice that I believe in, to have anything commemorating that lifted up in a public or communal space. And so, but is Arlington National Cemetery, does that count as a public? I actually don't know if that counts as a public space. I imagine, I think so. Yeah.
One of the public spaces.
So that, I think it should come down. I read somewhere maybe a few weeks or months ago that there were plans for it to be taken down, but I haven't seen anything since. But yeah, I don't think any of them should be up. I just think they should all be taken down.
Yes, and I know we have a question as well. Yes.
So thank you for this.
Can you pull the mic down, please, Dr.
Yes.
Thank you.
So thank you for this wonderful discussion. Like Dr. K, when she asked you who you wrote the book for, and you had a very surprising answer, right? When you said for your 15-year-old self, I would like to know how did the process of writing this book change you? How have you changed, both as a scholar, but also as a person, since you wrote the book for your past self? But yeah. How has this process changed you?
Yeah. I am now obsessed with public spaces. And I just, I wrote a big cover story for The Atlantic that came out about a month ago about Germany and how Germany memorializes the Holocaust relative to how the United States memorializes slavery. And I find myself deeply interested in, How the Word Is Passed was a very personal book in the sense that like I am the descendant of enslaved people, and I was exploring this history both on a sort of intellectual and scholarly and macro historical level, but also on a deeply personal level. I find myself going to places now that I don't necessarily have a personal relationship with, but that tell a story that I have come to realize I don't know enough about. So to be more concrete, beyond going to Germany, another thing, a place I've been recently was I went to the Manzanar internment camp in California, where tens of thousands of Japanese Americans and Japanese people of Japanese ancestry were imprisoned during World War II. And I went there with people who were born in the camps. And I went there with people who were the descendants of those who were held in the camps. And I am not of Japanese origin. And that history ostensibly is not connected to me at all, other than the fact that it was something that was done in this country not that long ago. And I realized that I didn't understand it, again, to repeat myself, from how the word is passed, in any way that was commensurate with the sort of legacy that it has left on this country. But going there gave me a profoundly different sense of what that history was. Because I was taught about, Japanese internment as this, as this benign. It was like, it was not great, but like, it wasn't that big a deal, but like, it was a mistake, but we fixed it, like, we apologized and it was fine. But like, then you go there and spend time with people who are in these camps. You go there and you hear these stories about not only the sort of psychological and physical trauma, but like what it meant for people. I mean, people were taken away from their businesses, people were taken away from their schools, people were taken away from their homes, and they went back and they weren't there anymore. I mean, like, there was so much devastation wrought on the Japanese and Japanese American community because of that I just had no idea about. And there's something about, again, putting your body in the place where history happened that just gives me such a more intimate sense. And so I'm very much am gonna be that dad who's like, all right, kids, we're going to the Civil War battlefield this summer. And they're like, Dad, no, it's like, we're gonna get an RV, we're gonna go. I'm ready. But I was like, we'll do it on the way to Disney World. We'll like stop there. So yeah, I think, intellectually, I think that's a big part of me. And I think I'll also just say I have a lot more humility about what I know and don't know. And you can make assumptions about things you think you know. Like, I thought I understood the Holocaust, and I didn't until I went there and put my body in the place where, on those train platforms, in, the crematorium, in the gas chamber. I mean, it changes you. You can't leave a place like Dachau and be the same after. So whether it's for my own writing or just for my spirit, I think it will be necessary for me to, I'll be doing that in different variations for the rest of my life.
Now, if possible, we have time for 3 more questions, but we're going to collapse them because we are doing a book signing. So we want to make sure we get that. We have the gentleman here, we have a gentleman over there, and then here, and then we'll end.
Yeah, thanks for coming. How do you feel about the removal of George Washington Monument, Jefferson Monument, and the Lincoln Memorial?
We're going to do all 3
Yes,
first.
we're going to go just get them all in there. That way he can give one answer.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I wanted to touch back on what we talked about in education earlier and how it could be really difficult for an educator to, even a great one, to help young people really access the nuance of a book like this. Do you, from your experience, have any advice for educators in doing that, especially, maybe at a school or in a community in which you have a lot of young people who come from diverse backgrounds in terms of what word has been passed to them and what's ingrained in them?
Thank you. So advice, and then of course about the monument. Yes.
Thank you for being here. With going from nonfiction to poetry, have you noticed any traits or skills of writing nonfiction that have carried over into your poetry writing?
Okay.
What should be done? Statues: George Washington, Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson. Again, not to be a broken record on it, but I think that there are people of good faith who think that those statues to those men should stay up, and people who think they should come down. I am not someone who believes that every statue of Jefferson should be taken down, or every statue of Washington should be taken down, or every statue of Thomas Jefferson or of Lincoln should be taken down. I mean, I think different monuments have different meanings and different contexts in which they were erected, different local context. And I think that those decisions should be made on hyperlocal levels, right? I think there are places where it is appropriate to remove a statue of George Washington. And there might be places where I might feel like it's less appropriate. So I can't give you a sort of blanket answer. I really do think it depends on the specific context in which they were erected and the specific community and the community's relationship to those monuments. How can folks teach about this history in different communities in different contexts who might have gotten a very different story? I think that one of the things that you do is like scaffold the conversation and scaffold the discussion. So, it's not a question of, I think a mistake is to go in and present history and say like, I don't care what you learned about this person. I don't care what your granddad told you. I don't care what you learned in your other classes. This is what's right. I don't think that's effective pedagogy. I think what it is you take history and you bring it to the students, and you do it with the understanding that this might run counter to many of the things that they have been taught before. And then you don't say this is what you need to believe, or this is the truth. I don't care what else you came into this classroom with, what you know. I think there are a lot of different creative ways you can do it. I mean, one of the simplest things to do is, if you're showing a movie, or if you're reading a book, or if you're like, we're going to learn about Thomas Jefferson, and you have them read notes on the state of Virginia, instead of moving right into like whole class discussion, I'm a big proponent, and I'm biased around this because I'm a writer, but like have like a 10-minute free write, right? Where you're just like, the student is just writing with their reaction, and there can be guidelines, like how does this compare to the version of Jefferson you knew before? And they're just writing, because the thing is that like, I remember when I was first year teacher, I came in and I was like, I'm gonna come in here, I'm gonna show eyes on the prize, and then we're gonna talk about it, and then we're gonna go and march, and then we're gonna, I was ready. And so I go in there and I show like some eyes on the prize documentary about like the Freedom Riders and the bus getting bombed, and then I'm like, all right, like let's talk about it. And all my students are just very quiet and just kind of looking at me and looking at the ground, because that's a lot. I came in with a not necessarily sort of facilitative energy. I came in hot, and it didn't allow space for them to process what they were seeing. And you might have those 1 or 2 or 3 students who like to talk all the time anyway, who will raise their hand and say something. But what's much more effective is like, you show the documentary, you do the thing, and it's like 10-minute free write, and then you get in small groups of 2 or 3, where somebody doesn't feel like they're going to look dumb if they say something wrong in like their pairs. And so then you're having conversation in small groups, and then you open it up to bigger groups, and then you're able to have a different sort of class discussion. And there are incredible resources: Learning for Justice, Teaching for Change, Zen Education Project, Facing History and Ourselves, that have all kind of great resources that I think can be really helpful. Poetry too. It's interesting. I usually get the question of like, how does poetry inform your nonfiction writing? Not how does nonfiction inform your poetry writing? I think that, I became a writer as a poet, and poetry is the sort of North Star of my writing. And no matter what, whether I'm writing during my journalism, during my scholarship, during my, or writing poetry itself, because what poetry does is it forces me to pay attention. Poetry for me is like the act of noticing. It is the act of, it's like when a photographer takes a picture of a tree, like and zooms in on a leaf, and it might be a tree they pass every single day. But when you zoom in on that leaf, you might see that like, it's not just the tree you pass every day, that one leaf on that one tree has like 5 different shades of green, and it's kind of becoming brown at the end from where like little caterpillars are nibbling on it. And you know, the sun at this time hits it in a certain way so that it kind of radiates and glows. And I think poetry for me is that, where it like forces me to stop and pay attention in a different sort of way. And in my nonfiction writing, I think part of what I try to do is pay attention not only to moments and to images, but also to ideas and to the things people are saying. Like I think that my, you know, I don't know that my interviews at a place like Blanford or Angola would look like they do or sound like they do if I wasn't a poet, because so much of what being a poet is just learning to listen and just stop and like not necessarily have a rebuttal. It's like, it's just taking something in. And so I move back and forth between genres and feel very lucky to be part of a tradition of a sort of Black intellectual and literary tradition where, you know, writers are not tied to a single genre, but instead recognize that different questions necessitate different forms and different mediums. And so many of the people I admire most were journalists and novelists and playwrights and poets. And there was no feeling like they had to choose one or the other. And I hope to write across many different genres over the course of my life. And I imagine that they will all, as they do now, continue to inform one another.
Thank you very much. Clint Smith, How the World is Past, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. We will have a book signing. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much.